In the winter of 1933, Kharkiv, Ukraine is a haunting sight, with buildings adorned in Soviet propaganda posters bearing eerie stark messages like "it's wrong to eat your children." Meanwhile, the streets are littered with decomposing bodies, yet the passers-by seem unfazed and don't even bat an eye at the horrors of their daily lives. To understand how things got like this, we need to go back to 1917. In 1917, after the fall of the Russian Empire, Ukraine briefly gained freedom from Russian control, but by 1922 it was forcefully integrated into the newly formed Soviet Union and became known as the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. At that time, Ukraine's population consisted mainly of villagers and farmers who placed great value on self-reliance. Owning and cultivating land held immense significance for Ukrainians, as the country boasted vast farmlands with incredibly fertile soil. It was renowned as a major grain producer, and Ukraine's agricultural prowess was central to its identity. But separate to this, Ukraine also had a strong cultural identity, deeply rooted in its language, traditions, folklore, and history. A few years later, in 1924 in Moscow, following the death of Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin would rise to power, and over the years he would come to be known as leader of the Soviet Union, and the plans he had would cause the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. Stalin was a paranoid man, always worrying about potential threats, uprisings, rebellions, and resistances against the Soviet Union. Ukraine, with its vibrant culture, in the eyes of Stalin, was a complete threat to what the Soviet Union stood for. In 1929, Stalin wanted to implement a series of 5-year plans, with each stage taking approximately 5 years, which became known as the 5-year plans. Stalin's ambitious 5-year plan was aimed at propelling the Soviet Union into the modern age through rapid industrialization and economic transformation. To achieve this, new policies and laws were created in the Soviet Union, which would aim at the collectivization of agriculture. In Ukraine, this plan took on a sinister guise, as Stalin's directives forced farmers into state-enforced farming collectives where individual landowners were stripped of their autonomy and placed into vast state-run agricultural enterprises. For the proud Ukrainian farmers who had long tilled the land with their own hands, this forcible collectivization represented an outrage to their way of life. Accustomed to the freedom of cultivating their own plots and reaping the fruits of their labor, they now found themselves shackled to the dictates of the Soviet state. As Stalin's control tightened, Ukraine's agricultural heartland felt the suffocating pressure of massive grain quotas, draining the land's vitality and plunging farmers into despair. Any resistance was met with brutal reprisals, as Soviet authorities cracked down mercilessly on anyone who would not adhere to the new way of life, branding them as traitors and saboteurs of the socialist cause. In 1932, Stalin's regime implemented deliberate policies to exacerbate food shortages in Ukraine. Soviet police swept through the countryside, forcibly confiscating not just grain, but anything edible from Ukrainian peasants. Livestock was slaughtered, fields lay barren, and whole villages left desolate and abandoned. When Stalin realized that people were leaving their villages to head for bigger areas for food, he would create borders around villages, stopping anyone from leaving to seek food elsewhere. And in January 1933, Stalin would deliver his final blow, sealing Ukraine's borders and trapping its people in a prison of famine. Those who dared to flee in search of sustenance were met by the Soviet patrols. Tens of thousands were caught trying to flee and would be sent straight back to their homes to starve. As the winter months dragged on, the harsh reality of hunger began to set in among the populace, and Ukraine descended into the depths of despair. With each passing day, the toll of starvation grew higher, claiming the lives of countless people. In a small village west of Kharkiv, hunger had ravaged the population, claiming the lives of many villagers. Those who managed to survive resorted to extreme measures to scavenge for sustenance. Eating grass, leaves, even animals that they had found dead and now rotting were on the menu. Pigeons and other birds were for the lucky ones who could catch them. But sometimes, in desperate cases, people would even eat the flesh of other humans. Among these survivors was Halina, a 6-year-old girl residing in a large house with her family. One day, against her parents' strict orders, Halina ventured into the garden. Just over the street, an elderly neighbour gestured to Halina. She was also saying something, but Halina couldn't hear her. The wind that day was far too loud. Unaware of the danger, Halina started approaching the old woman, until her older sister intervened, whisking her away. You might be thinking, what danger could an innocent old lady pose? But just weeks earlier, the same neighbour, driven to madness by hunger, committed an unthinkable act. She consumed her own children in a tragic bid to stave off starvation. This will be just one story of the many that will be caused by Stalin's genocidal famine. Stalin orchestrated an extensive disinformation campaign to conceal his role in its creation. Throughout the crisis, he viciously denied the existence of a famine, prohibiting Soviet press coverage and restricting access to foreign correspondence, particularly in Ukraine. Strategic language was employed to downplay the severity of the situation, framing it as mere food shortages or supply problems. Journalists and photographers who sought to expose the truth were often arrested and their work suppressed. Stalin further obscured the reality by destroying archives and even ensuring death certificates removed any mention of starvation as a cause of death. Despite decades of denial by the Russian government, the memory of the famine endured in Ukraine will be passed down through generations. After campaigns from the Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the recognition of the Holodomor as a genocide, 35 countries would issue statements acknowledging and recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide. But even today, Russia continues to assert that the famine affected both Ukraine and Russia equally. At the height of the Holodomor, 28,000 people were dying each day. The real numbers of the people killed remain unknown, as the Soviets did not keep precise records of their crimes against humanity. Various historians estimate the death toll to be between 3.9 to 10 million in just a single year. The fourth Saturday of November is considered the Holodomor Remembrance Day. Ukrainians all across the world will light up candles as a way to remember, reflect on, and grieve over the atrocities committed against their people.